I never thought humiliation could taste so bitter until my boss laughed at me in front of the entire team. He tore apart my presentation, mocked my ideas, and left me standing there like a fool. But what no one knew was that beneath my silence, I had already built something he could never control. A hidden door inside the system, a secret I had nurtured in the shadows. And while he believed I was broken, I was only waiting. Waiting for the moment when the empire he built on my work would collapse under its own weight, by my hand. I used to believe that hard work would speak for itself. 35 years old, a decade in the same tech company, and still I carried the weight of loyalty like a badge of honor. Every late night I stayed at my desk felt like proof that I was building something meaningful. I convinced myself that sacrifices, missing family dinners, skipping birthdays, were temporary investments. The truth, which I would only admit much later, was that the cost was permanent. That morning, I walked into the conference room with the kind of nervous excitement I hadn't felt in years. My project, an AI-driven fraud detection system, was ready for presentation. It had the power to save the company millions. My slides were sharp, my data airtight. As I clicked through the results, I caught sight of my boss leaning back in his chair. A smile crept across his face, not the kind that shared pride, but something darker. It was as if he already knew the ending to a story I hadn't even finished telling. The team nodded as I explained the algorithms, but his silence cut through the air heavier than any question. When I wrapped up, expecting at least polite applause, he finally spoke. "Interesting," he said flatly. Then the corners of his mouth curled again, a knowing smirk that made my chest tighten. In that moment, I realized he wasn't impressed. He was amused. Later that night, I returned home long after sunset. My daughter was already asleep. Her door cracked open just enough for me to peek inside. She had fallen asleep with her drawing pad on her chest, crayons scattered on the blanket. I stood there in the quiet, a lump forming in my throat. She was growing up watching me miss everything. My wife whispered from behind me, "You keep promising it's just for now, but what if now never ends?" I had no answer. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself even deeper. That's when I found it, the flaw. Buried inside the system's code was a vulnerability so subtle that almost no one would notice. If exploited, it could wipe out everything we had built. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should I report it and risk being blamed for a problem they'd claim I created? Or should I quietly fix it later when no one was watching? I closed the screen and chose silence. Better to guard it myself than hand it over to someone who would twist it into a weapon. But the cracks began to spread faster than I expected. In our next team meeting, the project was introduced again. This time, it wasn't me standing at the front. It was a new hire, barely 6 months in, delivering my words as if they were his own. My boss nodded enthusiastically, patting him on the back, praising his fresh perspective. My chest burned. I wanted to speak, to call it out, but when I glanced around the room, everyone avoided my eyes. They knew, and they stayed silent. Afterward, my boss turned to me with mock concern. "Michael, maybe you should take a step back. You've been stuck, haven't you? Sometimes it takes new blood to shake things up." His words sliced deeper than he knew. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe that was the point. I began to question myself. Maybe I was too old-fashioned. Maybe I wasn't as sharp as I thought. That's the cruelty of gaslighting. You start to doubt the truth you once held firm. At lunch, a colleague sat beside me, patting my shoulder. "Don't take it personally," he whispered. But when I followed his gaze, I saw his eyes flick nervously toward the boss, like he was performing for an audience. The reassurance felt staged, empty, another brick in the wall closing in around me. One evening, after another punishing day, I left the office later than everyone else. Passing by the executive wing, I heard voices leaking from a half-closed door. My boss's voice was unmistakable, smooth and confident. "The deal is nearly sealed. The system will be ours to leverage. He has no idea." My breath caught. They were talking about my project. My work wasn't just being stolen for glory. It was currency in a secret arrangement, a deal I hadn't been meant to hear about. I froze in the hallway, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that I had stumbled into something dangerous. The smirk at my presentation, the fake concern, the hollow reassurance from colleagues, it all aligned into a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. This wasn't incompetence or bad luck. This was betrayal, deliberate and calculated. I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears. They believed I was blind, beaten, and powerless. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had already begun to protect myself. And that smile my boss wore so carelessly, someday it would vanish. The first time I saw proof of what my boss was doing, it didn't come from whispers in the hallway or rumors at the coffee machine. It came from a contract, a glossy PDF tucked away on a shared drive that I wasn't supposed to have access to, marked with the company's insignia. The name of a shell firm appeared at the top, one I had never heard of before. My eyes darted across the page, and my stomach turned. There it was. My system, my algorithms, the very code I had poured years of my life into, listed as intellectual property under a different banner. I scrolled down, hands trembling. At the bottom was a signature, his signature, clean, confident strokes, binding everything I had created into the pockets of a company that didn't even exist 6 months ago. I sat back in my chair, my chest tight. All the late nights, the missed birthdays, the sacrifices, they had been converted into cash. Not for the company I believed in, not for the team I fought alongside, but for him. You ever feel that? That hollow punch in the gut when you realize your labor isn't yours anymore? That someone took your sweat, your time, and your faith and cashed it in like a poker chip? That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, dressed up in boardroom suits and signed with a flourish. The office around me buzzed with the low hum of keyboards and distant chatter, but to me, it felt like silence. I stared at the screen, numb, as if the world had frozen in place. That's when the ping of an incoming message jolted me back. An email appeared. No sender listed, no subject line, just a single attachment. Against every instinct screaming not to open it, I clicked. A simple text file blinked back at me. "He knows you're watching. Protect yourself. Don't trust anyone." My hands went cold. I scanned the office, heart pounding, but no one looked my way. Who had sent it? Another victim? A ghost in the machine? For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Later that evening, I passed the glass wall of the executive lounge and saw him inside, drink in hand, laughing with the very same new hire who had presented my work as his own. They looked like a father and son, a mentor passing the torch. But I knew better. He wasn't grooming talent. He was grooming an alibi. I pressed myself against the wall, listening as fragments of their conversation spilled into the hallway. "Once it's locked down," my boss said, swirling his glass, "we cut him loose, clean. No strings left." The younger man nodded. "And if he fights it?" A smirk. "He won't. He doesn't have it in him." The words sliced through me like glass. It wasn't enough that he had stolen from me. He intended to erase me completely, to brand me as disposable, irrelevant, maybe even dangerous. Walking home that night, the city lights blurred as rage tightened around my chest. I kept replaying his smirk, his confidence that I wouldn't fight back. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't built for war. But he didn't know what I carried inside me. The flaw in the system I had hidden, the back door I had designed, the knowledge he didn't even realize existed. I slipped into my apartment long past midnight. My wife stirred awake as I set my bag down, her voice soft with worry. "You're killing yourself, Michael. What's so important that you can't even sleep anymore?" I wanted to tell her everything, but the words died in my throat. How could I explain that the man who paid our mortgage was also the man stealing the very work that made it possible? That I was already standing on a cliff edge, one push away from losing it all? Instead, I kissed her forehead and whispered, "It's almost over." It wasn't a lie, just not the truth she thought. The next morning, I walked into the office with a calmness I didn't recognize. Around me, colleagues chatted about trivial deadlines, office gossip, coffee orders. They had no idea that beneath the surface, war drums were beating. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began quietly archiving every piece of evidence I could find. Contracts, emails, logs, every breadcrumb that tied him to the deal. As the files piled up, the email from the unknown sender burned in my mind. Don't trust anyone. My eyes flicked toward the glass office where he sat, smiling as if the empire was already his. He thought I was powerless. He thought I was blind. But I had seen behind the mask. And once you see the truth, you can never unsee it. The summons arrived without warning, an urgent meeting in the main boardroom. The tone of the message was clipped, formal, and left no room for interpretation. I knew before I even walked through those glass doors that the stage had been set. My boss sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior managers whose eyes carried a rehearsed indifference. The new hire who had paraded my work as his own was there too, staring down at the table, avoiding my gaze. "Michael," my boss began, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Serious concerns have been raised about your role in the project. Evidence has surfaced suggesting sabotage." The word hit me like a physical blow. Sabotage. I laughed once, bitterly. "That's absurd." He gestured to the projector. A file appeared on the screen, code scrolling in neat columns. My heart lurched. Embedded in the core framework was a string of malicious instructions, lines I had never written. My boss pointed with mock regret. "This is your login credential, isn't it? This is your work." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. The evidence was damning, airtight. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at me with pity, others with suspicion. Imagine yourself in that chair, accused with false proof. Would you fight back? Or would you fall silent, hoping the storm passes? I felt the weight of both choices pressing down on me. I clenched my fists. That code isn't mine. It's been planted. A ripple of whispers moved across the table. But my boss held up a hand, silencing them. Michael, denial won't save you. This company cannot afford rogue employees jeopardizing our future. And then, something I didn't expect happened. A voice spoke from the far end of the room. He's right. That code isn't his. All heads turned. It was Karen, a mid-level analyst, quiet, diligent, someone I'd always assumed was loyal to my boss. She stood, her face pale but resolute. I reviewed the logs. The timestamps don't align. This was inserted after Michael's shift, and I've seen the transfer files linking this system to an outside firm. My boss's smile faltered for the first time. Karen, you're mistaken. No, she said firmly. You're mistaken if you think no one is watching. For a brief second, hope flared inside me. But my boss quickly regained control, waving off her statement as confusion. Enough. We'll sort this out privately. He ended the meeting abruptly, dismissing everyone with a flick of his hand. As I left the room, my mind replayed Karen's words. The courage it took to stand against him. But courage alone wouldn't protect her, or me. That night, I sat in the dark of my apartment, the weight of defeat heavy on my chest. My wife's words echoed in my head. I don't want our daughter to grow up seeing her father only bow his head. I realized then that silence wasn't survival. It was surrender. I opened my laptop and navigated to the hidden framework I had built months earlier, my backdoor. The insurance policy I had designed the moment I sensed something was wrong. With a single keystroke, I began the upload. Contracts, emails, financial records, all pointing to the secret deal. By morning, the story had broken. News outlets swarmed with headlines. Whistleblower exposes corporate fraud. Screens lit up with leaked documents, undeniable proof of corruption. The empire my boss had built on deceit began to crack, each revelation hammering the foundation. But the twist was sharper than I anticipated. The documents implicated not just him, but multiple senior executives. Entire departments were entangled in the rot. This wasn't the betrayal of one man. It was a network, sprawling and poisonous. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, colleagues in shock, reporters demanding interviews, unknown numbers I dared not answer. And then, as I sat there watching the world burn, another email appeared. No sender, no subject, just one line. You're not the only one with the key. I stared at the words, a chill creeping up my spine. Someone else had been preparing, someone with access and leverage beyond mine. The mask had fallen, but the game was far from over. The story spread faster than I had imagined. Within hours of the leak, headlines dominated every major outlet. Fintech giant under fire for fraudulent deals. News anchors dissected the evidence, commentators speculated about the scope of corruption, and investors panicked. By the end of the week, the company's stock had plummeted to half its value. Customers pulled their accounts in droves, unwilling to trust a brand tainted by scandal. What once felt like an unshakable fortress was now collapsing in plain sight. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, there was only exhaustion. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some thanking me for exposing the truth, others terrified of what might come next. I ignored them all. For the first time in years, I had a different priority. That morning, I woke early and drove my daughter to school. She bounced in the back seat, humming a tune, oblivious to the storm raging in the adult world. When we arrived, she turned and said with a smile, "Daddy, you're early today." The words cut deeper than any insult my boss had ever thrown at me. I realized then how much I had missed, how much life had slipped through my fingers while I was chained to that office. Watching her walk through the school gates, backpack swaying, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. But peace was short-lived. By noon, new documents surfaced online. Information I hadn't released, financial records, offshore accounts, even private communications between board members. Whoever had sent me that cryptic message, "You're not the only one with the key," had made their move. My leak had been devastating, but this was annihilation. The fallout was immediate. Reporters camped outside the company headquarters. Protesters gathered with signs, demanding accountability. Inside, my boss scrambled to hold meetings, his once confident demeanor replaced with visible panic. Employees whispered about resignations, about contingency plans, about survival. And then, in the middle of a tense board meeting, the inevitable happened. A swarm of officials entered the building. Economic crime investigators in dark suits, badges flashing. They cut through the conference room like blades, silencing every voice. My boss froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color. The smirk he had worn so proudly when mocking me in front of the team was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar: fear. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone could stop. By the next week, the company was in full crisis. Senior staff were subpoenaed, offices raided, files seized. Employees who had once turned a blind eye now came forward, each testimony adding another nail in the coffin. My inbox filled with accounts from people I barely knew, each telling me how they had been silenced, threatened, or ignored. It was as if a dam had burst, years of pressure exploding into a flood. My boss, once untouchable, was suddenly cornered. But he didn't go quietly. Rumors spread that he had tried to buy protection, calling in favors from powerful allies in government. For a moment, I feared he might succeed, that money and influence would sweep his sins under the rug. But then the twist came. The very officials he had bribed now turned against him. Desperation made him reckless, and in reaching for their help, he exposed their connection. They cut ties instantly, letting him drown alone. It struck me then. Have you ever noticed how the ones who seem the strongest often stand alone when the ground gives way? Power isolates, and when the crowd turns, there's no one left to catch you. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. One evening, as I sat in my apartment with the news playing in the background, there was a knock at the door. My chest tightened. I opened it to find him standing there, my boss. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale, his eyes burning with something I couldn't read. Rage? Desperation? Maybe both. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything between us pressing down. Then he spoke, voice hoarse but steady. "We need to talk." He stood in my doorway like a ghost, stripped of the authority that once cloaked him. Gone was the polished executive, the untouchable man who could humiliate me with a single smirk. What remained was someone hollow, cornered, and frighteningly human. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was low, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I let him inside. We sat at the kitchen table in a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air. Finally, he spoke. "You think I betrayed you, and I did. But you need to understand, I was already trapped." I wanted to laugh in his face, to tell him nothing could excuse what he'd done. But something in his eyes stopped me. They weren't defiant anymore. They were broken. He leaned forward. This wasn't just me. The deal, the fraud, the contracts, none of it was mine alone. There's a network, Michael. Bigger than this company, bigger than me. They control everything. Dozens of firms, entire markets. I signed because I had no choice. You either play along or you disappear. The words chilled me. For years, I had thought my fight was against one man, one corrupt boss. But now the battlefield expanded, stretching into shadows I hadn't dared imagine. I said nothing, my hands gripping the table. In the next room, my daughter's laughter floated in as she played with her crayons. The sound tore at me. What was the cost of chasing justice? How many more nights would I miss at her side? How much more of her childhood would slip through my fingers while I fought battles against faceless giants? I stood and walked to her room, watching her scribble with bright colors. She looked up, grinning. "Daddy, draw with me." I knelt beside her, hugging her so tightly she squealed in protest. In that embrace, I felt the full weight of the path I had chosen. Justice was never free. It always demanded something precious in return. When I returned to the kitchen, he was holding out a small object, a flash drive. "Take this," he said. "It's everything. Names, accounts, proof of the network. With this, you can bring them all down. But once you use it, you'll never be safe again." My heart pounded as I reached for it. The metal felt heavy, like it carried the weight of an entire world. He met my gaze, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, only resignation. "I've already lost. Maybe you can do what I couldn't." That night, I plugged the drive into my computer. Files unfolded like a map of corruption, bank transfers, offshore havens, secret communications linking executives across industries. It was worse than I had imagined. The rot wasn't isolated, it was systemic, a machine that devoured integrity and spat out profit. But as I scrolled deeper, something else emerged. Buried among the files were encrypted messages, signatures from people inside other companies. They weren't part of the corruption. They were resisting it. Quietly, anonymously, they had been collecting their own evidence, waiting for a moment like this. I reached out to one of the contacts, half expecting silence. Instead, I received a reply within minutes. "We've been watching you. You're not alone." The realization stunned me. For so long, I had felt isolated, carrying my secret like a curse. But now, a network of whistleblowers stretched out before me. Others who had risked their careers, their lives, to fight the same invisible enemy. And then came the shock that made me sit back in disbelief. Among the names listed as allies were leaders I had once despised, executives I believed complicit. They had played their roles so convincingly, I never suspected their double lives. Some of the very people I thought were enemies had been feeding information into this underground resistance. I stared at the screen, torn. On one side was the chance to finish it, to detonate the truth and cripple the system for good. On the other was my family, the quiet mornings, the laughter of my daughter, the fragile peace I had just begun to taste. So I ask you, what would you do? Would you press forward, sacrificing everything for justice? Or would you turn away, protecting the little world you still had left? The cursor blinked on my screen, waiting. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling with the weight of the decision. And as the night stretched into silence, I realized there was no choice that didn't cost something. The drive lay beside me, its secrets burning like fire in the dark. The weeks after the revelations felt surreal. One chapter of my life had ended in fire and ruin, yet another quietly began. I was offered a position at a small but ambitious startup, one that prided itself on transparency and fairness. Unlike the glass towers I had grown used to, their office was modest, tucked into a renovated warehouse with open desks and laughter spilling from every corner. For the first time in years, I walked into work not as a suspect, not as a pawn, but as someone valued for his skills. What surprised me most was who greeted me. The founders were not fresh-faced dreamers straight out of college, but veterans scarred by the same betrayal I had endured. They had once worked under men like my former boss, had their ideas stolen, their reputations crushed. Now, they had built a haven for people like us, a company born out of pain but sustained by integrity. The irony was sharp. His victims had risen from his shadow to build something better, something he could never touch. Life found a rhythm again. For the first time, I kept promises. On the day of my daughter's birthday, I left the office early. We decorated the house together, candles flickering on the cake as she sang louder than anyone else. I didn't check my phone, didn't sneak glances at emails. I was there, fully, completely. When she leaned against me after opening her presents and whispered, "This is the best birthday ever," I felt a peace I hadn't known since before the storm. But peace is fragile. A week later, an email slipped into my inbox. No sender, no subject. Just a single line. "The network isn't gone. They're watching your new company. You're next." I stared at the words, the chill crawling down my spine. It wasn't over. The system I had exposed wasn't a single tree. It was a forest, its roots running deep, its branches spreading wide. For a moment, I considered deleting it, pretending I had never seen it. But denial was just another form of surrender. Meanwhile, the company I had left behind crumbled completely. Its assets were liquidated, its reputation shattered. My old boss vanished from the financial world, his name scrubbed from headlines, his presence erased. Some said he fled overseas. Others whispered he was swallowed by the very network he had served. Whatever the truth, he was gone. I had choices to make. Rather than fade into obscurity, I channeled my experience into something larger. Alongside allies, I established a foundation dedicated to protecting employees who faced injustice in their workplaces. We offered legal aid, counseling, and most importantly, a voice for those silenced by fear. The foundation grew quickly, fueled by stories as haunting as mine. One afternoon, while visiting a community center we supported, I saw a familiar face. It was Daniel, the colleague who had once whispered false comfort in the office while secretly feeding my boss information. I froze, anger sparking instinctively. But then I noticed what he was doing. Helping a young worker draft a complaint against an abusive employer, guiding her through the process with patience. He caught my eye, shame flickering across his face. Later, he approached me quietly. "I was weak," he admitted, "but I'm trying to make it right." I didn't answer, only nodded. Inside, a question burned. Was forgiveness the final act of victory? Or was it weakness disguised as mercy? The world around me kept shifting, but at home, one truth remained steady. Each night, I tucked my daughter into bed, her eyes heavy with dreams. She no longer asked why I was gone so much. She no longer wondered why her father seemed so tired. On one of those nights, as the city lights bled through the window and the hum of life softened into silence, I sat at her bedside. Her tiny hand rested in mine, warm and trusting. I leaned close and whispered the promise I had carried through every storm, every betrayal, every scar. I kept my word, I told her softly. The bad men didn't win. For the first time, I believed it.